all of the attendees, you have now been made panelists as we move into the last 10 minutes or so. Feel free to jump in and talk a little bit. Bridget, I'm going to pick on you if you don't mind. If you could unmute yourself.
He did say that epistemological issue remains in historiography, so I don't know if we're ready for his intellectualizing.
We probably are not, but we should just send a shout out to Ronald Takaki, a historian who has done a brilliant job of connecting the histories and struggles of Asian Americans, Latino Americans, and African Americans in some very brilliant ways. So there's some folks out there who've really been at the task of connecting these intersections. And so to all the attendees, please join our conversation for a few minutes before we wrap up.
And Regent, I wouldn't have come at your intellectualizing if I didn't love you.
Okay, so can am I on?
You are on.
All right. You know, I have been really very distressed by historians recently, and architectural historians, for instance, the ones I deal with, they're all ready to talk about what Cornell and Harvard is talking about, equity and racial justice, but their perspective, where they stand from when they write history, is Eurocentric. They begin with the modern movement, they begin with Renaissance. And so, I mean, you know, we can talk about all these little shortcuts and, ways to respond to today's events by, adding curriculum on a few African American or Latino histories. But the problem here is structural. It's the way we write history from the perspective from which we see the history. So that's where Ronald Takaki comes in. He changed the perspective. And that's another question that we have to ask is, why is American history, what is the perspective we write American history from? Sorry.
That's a great point. And I see Laura Matthew, my colleague over at Marquette, is making a similar point, right? About this question of how we ensure that at any educative level, we're not making these stories or histories additive, right? We're just kind of plugging them into the narratives that already exist. And I think that's why, I'm an ethnic studies scholar myself, and we start from different viewpoints, right? As opposed to, as you note here by citing Ronald Takaki, to not start with the question of westward expansion as kind of your starting point, but to look at different ways in which we can conceptualize not only American history, but the history of the Americas, or a history of the Atlantic slave trade as being part and parcel of American history as well, right? But it really does require that we completely disrupt the way in which we conceptualize U.S. History, national history.
Yeah, I think, I mean, given what we're going through right now with the COVID virus, teaching online, I've totally begun to rethink the way I teach the American Survey. And I think Laura's point about coverage, I mean, for a long time, it was just you cram as much as you can within the class, and that just doesn't work. I mean, students don't retain much at all. And so we really have to focus on what skills you want the students to have. And obviously, the ability to think about race and think about protests and think about struggles, it should be central to any history. And for example, my history class, I think I'm going to start with 1918 and not 1865 and talk about the Depression and just totally rethink the chronology and build the course around what skills I want the students to take away from the class, as opposed to just give them all the history and hope they retain something,
Absolutely. And what we know in terms of what comes with the responsibility of being an instructor, particularly around these issues, is young people especially, and all folks get really fired up when they see themselves in the history. Mm-hmm. The importance of seeing oneself as an actor in that historical drama and not simply the subject. I often say, I did not really come to understand how to teach the African-American experience more effectively until I learned about the Black experiences in Central and Latin America and the Caribbean. Like those other regions of the hemisphere taught me a lot about the experiences here in the US. And I want to shout Nate Rice out. Nate mentioned that history teachers need to invest in learning. Nate, you want to say anything about that? love to hear your voice today if you're still with us.
Yeah, we, in fact, just ironically, we're sitting right now in our school district trying to re-envision how we're going to do our U.S. history class. And I think, you know, back to that point of where do you build the structure? So right now we're kind of tinkering around the edges and how can you infuse some of this in randomly or very intentionally, but how you're really going to transform what the kids are learning. You know, having a situation where kids can choose topics for further research, which is I think is great, but if that only happens that way and it's not coming from the teacher and those kids' identities and culture aren't validated, then the institution itself continues to suffer, that it's an us versus them kind of thing. So to the degree that we can come and wrap our arms around some of these histories that you're talking about locally with the images, and also just having kids who may have relatives who have been part of this, you know, push for equal justice and their voice in our society, it's powerful. So I'm hoping that we can inspire the educators to do the work that it takes to understand this and bring passion to it in the classroom. And you guys are doing a great job of inspiring me, and I think everyone else on this call. So the thing is, how do we get this out to our other educators? Today's been fabulous. So thank you, everybody.
I think something Rob and I have been texting about this late at night. One of the reasons I think that we continue to fail to achieve systemic change in Milwaukee is that we want to rush past truth and just get to reconciliation. And I think there's been shades of that in what's just been discussed. I mean, getting even to what Laura was mentioning or what Arijit was mentioning, and both the panelists as well, which is that if you keep on going with sort of the reconciliation method of addending history to add more stories, they become afterthoughts. You know, they become not the canon, but they become the electives. And I think that question of like, you know, so I asked Rob the other day, who Rob knows, like, what would real truth and reconciliation happen? Because we always want to sprint past truth and just say sorry for the things that we haven't admitted that we have any culpability or accountability for. So, yeah, I hope we can stop just having the inadequate conversations of how we keep nudging and critiquing it as opposed to changing the core. Tanya, you have your hand raised.
Zoom protocol. Way to go, Tanya.
Yeah, I just.
You know what? Okay. Yes, I am the nerd who rose my hand. Thank you. It's just everyone is saying so many incredible things, and I'm not a brilliant educator. So I have one observation, perhaps, and a question. As far as the history teachers discussing of like reconfiguring how you teach your classes, like that's so incredible to hear. And I would say from my experience of taking art history at MyAd, I ran the gamut of types of professor, like the way they taught. And one thing that really impressed me is Dr. Chesney Adams, Chris Chesney Adams, taught her class non-chronologically and like began by making sure that we could understand our place as artists, or in this case, it was a modern design. So designers, their place in this timeline, and then kind of like went back and then like forward. And so that's very encouraging to hear people rethinking the structure of the curriculum. My question is, how can third spaces help with bridging this divide? So I work for, well, in ordinary times, I work for Milwaukee Public Library. I do young adult programming on a very shoestring budget, but like I'm trying to think of like, how can I, if not at my branch, perhaps at one of my coworkers' branches, be a space to bring this kind of discussion in history to more people. Granted, I will say it's really hard to get teens to show up to anything, but for those who do have that audience, I think this could be something incredible. So how can third spaces, whether it's the library or other spaces, help in this effort?
And let me also add to that, I want to acknowledge Virginia's question about interpreting history in the public, the public spaces as well. And so let's talk a little bit about Tanya's question, and let's also get into the importance of public history in making all this more available and accessible.
I think a regent would probably have a lot to say about this, because this is what he does, right? He has his students go out into the community and research buildings and spaces and analyze those spaces. So I think obviously getting out in the community, though, it's a little bit more difficult now with COVID, but actually, getting out into the community and researching and attaching the history to the building, to the space, is an important part of this.
I think one thing I would add is, and not to make this history too utilitarian, but what are the tools that students who could consider themselves activists or are burgeoning activists that they feel like they need to continue the work that they're doing in their communities, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when I teach a Latinx civil rights movements class, the thing that I emphasize for those students that are in that class very specifically to refine their skills as young activists is, what can we learn from these past movements? We can do plenty by looking at these images here as students continue to use the occupation of space as a tool to make their demands heard, and look at the ways in which past activists have kind of developed their strategies and what can be kind of transmitted into the work students are doing today.
One last comment, Laura, you want to jump in and talk a little bit about the importance of diversity of courses on these topics, and if we don't ever want to allow chronology to hamstring us in the classroom. Themes are very valuable. Sometimes it's frightening for the instructor to get outside of that more traditional approach. The thematic approaches are very great. I've taught courses in reverse chronological order. So starting with the more contemporary and moving backward, I was worried about that, but it worked. So Laura, can you jump in and talk a little bit about the question around more courses?
Well, I know I made the comment. I appreciate all this so much, and especially Tanya, your comment, and Rob, all of us following up on this idea of the importance of slowing down enough and bringing out the things that we think will be useful to the students. But then I often feel this added pressure where my sense is that my students may never have another I teach Latin American history, and we talk about it transnationally, and we bring comparisons with the United States, whether we're talking about movements like these in the 1960s, or we're talking about the African slave trade, or all the numerous other ways in which the Americas are connected. And it can be overwhelming. Years ago, I very intentionally really beefed up the Christopher Columbus, pre-contact, pre-colonialism section on Indigenous America, and gender, honor, and violence went out. I mean, the gender stuff was so rich and had such great conversations the students had about that, and I just didn't have room. It's a struggle for all of us. So if we could all push for, I mean, it's impossible, right? More opportunities for more students to take these history classes, so that we don't all feel this obligation to try and, what do you leave out? It's so challenging.
Right, and it's
so hard.
Because we know that there are some core topics and themes that we have to make sure are included, and that can take an entire course, no matter what the course, and so it does take some dexterity and some other words that I don't have right now to make this more robust in a lot of ways. The last thing we'll say, and thanks Virginia, let's never ever forget about the role of art in the education process, which is why we like to start with the images. The artists have the capacity to get us to feel. Artists have the capacity to get us to think in creative ways that really oftentimes the more traditional social scientist and or humanities scholar might not be able to do right away. So make sure to bring in the artists where possible, because they are able to do some things that are really important for learning. And Virginia's comment about the UMOS mural on First Street is a brilliant example that brings together all of what we're talking about right now.
You know, Tanya, to Tanya's point, I got to work on an NEA grant, an Our Town grant at the Mitchell Street Library in its first 2 years of existence. And that infused that library with art and artists who imagine how that space could be used and interface with community in ways that aren't necessarily where the programming staff typically thinks. And I think allowing
And I
then
love you
also
for
artists,
that, Adam.
thanks. And I just think like, yeah, so if I had any poll, I'd advocate for an artist in residence program to be continued at the library, but we'll see about that. But that all being said, I do think sometimes also then allowing artists to work in their messiness is really important, and not to expect for them to conform the formats that are the one you bring them into challenge formats, and that's what they're good at. And then also asking them to abide by those same formats, that can be really hamstringing.
Well, folks, thank you very much. We have reached the hour mark. We know that we are all both Zoom savvy, and we are experiencing major Zoom fatigue these days. But we thank you for your time today. We want to highlight a couple of our upcoming discussions. We're going to talk about Latinx women's voices next week around issues of feminism, culture, and activism. And then on July 3rd, what we've begun to do at the end of each month is that we just have an informal table talk / happy hour where we jump on a Zoom call and we talk even more openly and personally about ways that we are approaching the classroom and providing each other tips about what works for us. And so please look forward to joining us. We'll make sure to email you those invitations as well. And then in July, we'll be talking about food and culture in the Cream City. It is indeed festival season in Milwaukee, and with our pandemic, we are missing our festivals significantly. And so we want to bring some of that into our conversations. And then in August, we will talk about voting. Voting, voting, vote. Everybody say it with me, vote, 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 vote. And I'm going to stop our live stream right now on Facebook, and we'll sit here for a few minutes. Thank you, panelists. Sergio, Joe, appreciate your expertise. Attendees, appreciate all of you all's expertise as well. Thank you all so very much. We'll hang out here for just a few more minutes in the event there's some other conversations, but I am currently stopping the live stream. Thank you, folks.